Welcome, everybody. I'm Wilhelm van Rensburg, Senior Art Specialist at Strauss Company, and I'm joined by Arisha Maharaj, also a specialist in our Johannesburg offices. We're joined today by Atose Aguele, Brett Scott, Olivia Anani, and Laura Vincenti. This is the second in a series of webinars. Tonight, we're looking at giving collecting direction, how to build figurative African art into your collection. And this is, of course, part of the big exhibition that Lee Leider and I, organized in Cape Town at the Welgemeend Art Center. And that exhibition is called Giving Direction, Figuration, Past and Present. On Monday, just to recap very briefly, we looked at historical conditions that gave rise to the production and consumption of figuration in Africa. And Arisha, just to highlight what we mean by figuration. A brief definition is that figuration is really a conceptual thread that runs right through historical, traditional, modernist, as well as contemporary African art, the evidence of which you can clearly see in these two portraits. On the right, a portrait by Irma Stern, painted of a Congolese woman, painted in 1938, and on the left, Zahele Mahole, a work recently done by her in 2018. Now, the modernists, and what we're after is really looking at, modernist African art or African modernism. And as you can see from the Stern portrait, the pursuit there by means of figuration, and figuration can include such things as portraits, figure studies, group portraits, peopled interiors, and the like. And the modernist pursuit is really to do with a formalist tradition. In Stern's case, really expressionism. Whereas when you talk of figuration in a contemporary setting, such as Zanele's, then we're looking at other issues such as identity, gender, race, and the like. So figuration there has another function. Even if you look at traditional African art, like you see on the left there, those are examples from early 20th century. You will see that the figuration is evident in those works as well, but also in contemporary African artists such as the work on the right by Deborah Bell. In terms of the time period, that to do with a stylistic concept of figuration. But if you look at time, Arisha, then you will see that we can demarcate the modernist period, such as what Okwe Mbezo did in his seminal exhibition, The Short Century. And you will see the demarcation that he indicates there runs from 1945 to 1999, aligning very clearly the art production and various forms of art production when you just look at what all the categories running down on the right-hand side of the cover of the catalog, aligning the art production of the modernist era in Africa with the political changes. Now, the first country in Africa to gain its independence was, of course, Ghana in 1957. His period ends in 1994 when South Africa, in a manner of speaking, became a democratic country. But, Arisha, then I always try to define when. I'm a diehard art historian, and I always want to find out when exactly we start talking about contemporary art. And for me, the key date is 1989. And on the right, I just enumerate a number of changes, social, political, economic, that changed the world in a fundamental way in that particular year, as well as the art production ever since. The fall of the Berlin Wall, for instance, end of communism and the advent of new liberalism and late capitalism, Tiananmen Square massacre with a focus on global human rights, widespread use of the World Wide Web or the internet. And then for us as artists or people in the art world, two major exhibitions. The first one in Paris, Magicians of the Earth, and in London, The Other Story. And these two exhibitions drew attention specifically to the lack of inclusion of contemporary African artists in major exhibitions or biennales and the like, and they proposed alternatives. And since then, Arisha, if you can look at the next slide, since then, there was a proliferation. It was actually a type of identity marker, if you like. Apart from contemporary African art, all of a sudden people start talking about contemporary art in the Middle East, contemporary art in Latin America, contemporary art in Eastern Europe, contemporary Chinese art. And the next one, and as a result, you know, if you just take contemporary African art, you can see that identity is propped up by quite a number of institutions, activities, and the like, such as new art galleries in Africa and their artists in their stable, you know, art fairs, art biennales, mega exhibition locally and overseas, books and journals, art prizes, auction houses, the academy, museums, residencies, curators, and a number of art databases talking about contemporary African art. For example, if we can just look at art journals, for instance, NKA deals with contemporary African art. The next one, for example, Art Africa locally, and I'm just showing you the covers of some of the issues. The next one shows the art museums dedicated to specifically contemporary art from the continent, apart from Zaitsmokka that you can see on the left, and one of the recent exhibitions on the art of Namibia. There's also a Museum of Contemporary African Art in Cairo. The next one shows then some major mega exhibitions, these two both mounted at the Smithsonian Museum of African Art, but of course including modernist as well as contemporary African art. And the next slide would show you some of a traveling exhibitions such as Africa Remix 2007. This particular exhibition traversed the world, you know, from Japan, America, Europe, South Africa, and the likes. The next one looks at art in the diaspora. This one was in New York. We can also then look at, you know, there are a number of institutions propping up this identity of what you and I today call contemporary African art. But specifically, our topic today is collecting, and sometimes art collectors revert to books such as this one that Arisha is showing now. So The Art of Buying Art, How to Evaluate and Buy Art Like a Professional Collector. I found the divisions quite curt. It is simply define, select, research, buy, but it's quite a thick book, and it does contain quite interesting hints and tips, and I do urge you to buy it in order to become a professional collector. But more seriously, you will see in this particular slide, there was a special supplement started by Art Africa called Collector, and all of a sudden, collectors started using a completely different discourse. And these are the issues that collectors of contemporary African art now start talking about. Luxury or legacy, risks and rewards, places of growth, the Black Collectors Forum, auction houses, the rise of the new African galleries, artists to watch, alternative access classes, old masters, new realities, or sometimes they also refer to it masters we need to master. So you also, in the next slide, you will see a number of surveys being done on this particular topic. And I think the one that most collectors of contemporary African art would like to get their hands on is the top 50 artists and the top 20 curators who evaluated them. But we're going to go on now to start talking to, Arisha is going to start talking to one collector, one major collector of contemporary African art.
Thank you, Wilhelm. Yeah, so I mean, as our first panelist, I'd like to welcome Atose. He is a collector, or rather a custodian of the African arts. Atose, maybe to start the conversation of collecting African art and building figuration or figurative African art into your collection, maybe you want to start by just telling us a bit about your collection and maybe the motivation behind your collecting practice.
Thank you for the introduction, Arisha. Glad to be here. When I got this invitation, oftentimes you sort of wonder if you should have a prepared statement or just, in fact, just have a conversation about, really how you feel about collecting and sort of what motivated that. My sort of interest in art, I think, was very early on in my life. But I would say the idea of buying to keep, and I like to use the word custodian of art, but buying to keep, I started to think about that about 30 years ago. And one of the things that was quite interesting is, and I hear a lot of young people say, well, we want to collect art, but we understand it's expensive. Certainly 30 years ago, I didn't have that much money to collect, but I had a great interest in art. There wasn't a real central theme that sort of governed how I collected. I, at that time, lived in Lagos, Nigeria, and that was primarily where my interest lay. So I would, for example, look around. I was quite familiar already with some of the old masters at that time, the Benuans and some of the other masters. And it was very early stages for collecting on the continent. One of the things that really struck me about some of the early works I collected was just the technical ability of some of the artists. And another thing that really drove me to buy art was how art was almost, or what I was buying at that time was almost a snapshot in time, capturing a particular time in our history, a short contemporary Nigerian history, for example. That was quite interesting to me. And that's, I would say there's one thing that stood out. It would be the idea that, you could pretty much peek into history by seeing some of these pieces. And that's really how I started. It wasn't, I obviously didn't start with an ultimate goal in mind, but it just happened that I started to collect a lot more figurative works. I would say 5-6 years into collecting, I started to look at artists outside Nigeria. And so typically that would have been, for us at that time, Ghana, and a few interesting artists outside West Africa. So for example, Mukasa in Uganda. And that really became a basis, central to my collection for quite a while, until, of course, I visited South Africa for the first time, and then was exposed to contemporary South African art, which was quite fascinating for me. I think that was probably the first time I thought, well, I am putting together a collection, and I'm putting together a Pan-African collection. And it's obviously, this was about 15 years ago. And it's been quite interesting to see in the collection, a Benuan sitting alongside a Sokoto, a Pemba, and almost a central theme that runs through all of them, regardless of what country they come from. So that's really, in a nutshell, what has motivated me to continue to collect.
Oh, that's great. it is great to see sort of the different artists all in one collection. So having the Benin Wangus with the Gerald Sequoias and the George Pembers. And I guess that's sort of what the whole idea around this Figuration exhibition is. So I've asked you to select 3 of your favorite works from the exhibition that's coming up in Cape Town. And I think the first of your selection was the Benin Wangu in The Girls in Waiting. And can you tell us why this was one of your favorites? I mean, I know this is one of the first artists that you sort of admired in your early stages of collecting.
Yes. So Aegon was obviously, I think, arguably Africa's most prominent artist, at least one of them. This particular piece came late in my collecting. So this piece was acquired a few years ago. And what fascinated me about this piece was, first of all, it was done in 1959. A fairly very modern piece for that time. 1959 was right at the cusp of our independence in Nigeria. So Nigeria, the country became independent in 1960. And this piece was basically a representation of the role women played running up to the independence period. And as you can see, there's a lady almost opening a curtain to say, we're coming out. We're also part of this conversation. We're also part of this new Nigeria. So it was quite modern for that time. And I think that's what really fascinated me about this work. It's quite, a really revealing work. It's obviously very technically fantastic work. So that's really what drew me to this particular painting.
Yeah, and then the next one we have, and I think this might be part of your personal collection, is another work by Ben. We actually had his son Oliver on our talk or on our discussion on Monday evening, which is also quite interesting. But what is it about this work that drew you in?
So this particular work is more personal. So Ben Wangu comes from an area in Nigeria where my mom is from. And so they sort of share the same area. And this work was, I believe, a painting of a lady who was related to the artist, Ben Wangu. And it reminded me so much of my mom and my aunties. And so that really, so from a personal point of view, that drew me to this work. It's also, very well done. And this is probably, I'd say, one of the oldest ones in my collection. And I bought this quite early in my collecting. So but what draws me to it, as I said, it's more personal. It's very familiar in terms of its representation.
And then the last one of your selection is the George Pember, which obviously in South Africa, he's also one of our sort of masters. This work was also included in Wilhelm's exhibition last year, looking at George Pember and Robert Hodgins. And we're glad to have it back on this exhibition. And can you tell us why this is one of your favorites?
So this is, earlier on, I talked about, how art can be almost a view into the past. And I think this is, and by the way, that's the case in most of the works you're going to exhibit. It was very difficult to pick one work over the other. So in picking these 3 works, it's certainly not a slight on the other works. They're all great. But this does capture a time in South Africa where, African families had to frequently move, or at least move. And the family effort in trying to get that done. So that's really what fascinates, that's really what this work is about. I think just technically, just the background and almost a storm coming also it's just a fascinating work with everybody just trying to move, trying to trek. So that's really what interested me in this work.
Yeah, like what you said, they really just capture a moment of time, and they do it in a certain way that brings out so much more emotion that you would get sort of in maybe a photograph. A painting can be so much more. And so you've been a collector for a number of years. So have you noticed sort of any trends in collecting art over the past maybe 15, 30 years? Is there any collecting trends?
I think what's quite interesting now is the fact that a lot of collectors are looking at collecting from a continental point of view, sometimes even from a global point of view. There is that trend. So, you see South African collectors who are quite familiar with works from Uganda or from works from Nigeria or Ghana and vice versa. And that's, I think, one trend that I think I'm noticing, which is very encouraging. I think it's easier to do it, obviously, with technology and the fact that information is much easily shared. So that's one particular trend. Another trend which didn't exist when I started was the auction houses. And yes, they're essentially commercial in nature, and that's what they do. But they have provided structure, I think, to what we do. Collecting was really an art, definitely not a science 30 years ago, at least collecting African art. Today, there's a little bit more of a structure, in collecting. And so if you're new to collecting, you can be guided by, for example, and if your main interest, which it should be, is value or trying to diversify asset classes, the auction houses do provide for records and information on some of these values. So I think auction houses and the role they play in collecting has been a new, and I understand in South Africa it wasn't new. I think auction houses have been around a lot longer in South Africa, but on the continent certainly it's very new. The first auction in Nigeria was probably about 25 years ago. And of course, we have the international auction houses that have now a keen interest in, once or twice a year, they have fairly large auctions. So I think that has also opened up the art space to a lot more people. The other, of course, trend I see is the amount of galleries, museums. That is also increasing awareness, art awareness. And so a lot more younger people are also getting involved in buying and collecting art. That's certainly a new trend for me, even though I was quite young when I started. So these are the trends I'm noticing, and they're quite encouraging.
Yeah, I definitely think that art is basically becoming more accessible, especially with the help of technology and the increase in sort of galleries and auction houses across the continent and across the world. Lastly, I don't want to keep you too long, but lastly, what advice would you give to maybe a new collector looking to start an African art collection?
Look, I think, and the advice I will give is not an advice I took early, but I will give it anyway. I think the first speaker that did speak about lots of literature out there now. So there's a lot of work. People have written quite extensively on collecting, and I think if you're a new collector or even an older collector, I think it would be helpful and useful to acquaint yourself with some of the publications I think that's one way to start. I think visiting galleries, every opportunity. I think keeping an open mind, I think that's quite important. I think understanding also what you like. I think oftentimes people are trying to predict what is going to be popular in the future. That's a mistake in my view. I think first, what do you like? And yeah, obviously it has to be able to hold its value. But holding value is not being able to flip it in 5 years. I mean, holding value is, art is a long game. It's not, and if your purpose is to hold and dispose of in the future, it is a long game. It's not something that, you know, there might be people that are quite good at buying and selling, but understand that if you're a collector, you're not an art dealer. And so, you know, you've got to keep that in mind. So certainly what you like, learning as much as you can about that artist, about that period. If it's a period you like, I think those are important aspects of collecting.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, obviously always having a look at the art fair, at the exhibitions, even auction viewings. You can learn so much from literally just looking. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you being on the panel. I think we're going to head over to Wilhelm, and he is going to go through our next guest. You're on mute, Wilhelm.
Right, Brett Scott, you are from the Scheryn collection. You manage that. So tell us about the Scheryn collection. What is the acquisition policy? How is it managed? Not everybody is familiar with them.
Sure. Thanks, Valen, for the introduction and for inviting me on today. Yeah, so the Scheryn collection is a private art collection based in Cape Town. The collection is focused on collecting work from African contemporary art and the diaspora. The collection has been around since the end of 2015 and is a unique collection, and that consists of 3 collectors collecting together. So the 3 collectors are Herman Steyn, De Bing Chen, and Piet Viljoen. And yeah, I mean, the collection was set up in that way as a more collaborative and I guess more social motive, in the sense of being able to meet, being able to discuss art that they liked, being able to just discuss works that they'd seen, and be able to just chat to other people. So getting different opinions, because I think obviously everybody has their own tastes and that kind of stuff, and it's quite nice to be able to talk to different collectors and understand what they like and why they like works, and if that can sort of influence your decisions around art and what you like to collect. Currently, the collection is at about 320 works, and we collect across all mediums: painting, photographs, sculpture, tapestries, works on paper, and we also collect video and have recently purchased our first sound work. So yeah, we sort of try to collect across all different mediums and be representative of those mediums in the collection. And yeah, I mean, in terms of our acquisitions policy, we have a yearly budget which we allocate towards acquisitions and admin. And yeah, we usually try to divide that up into quarters, you know, we attend fairs and go to gallery exhibitions, that kind of thing. So if we're planning the beginning of sort of our year, we'll look at, you know, there'll be the Cape Town Art Fair coming up in Feb. There's usually Basel in June, Art Joburg in September, and Frieze in October in London. So we'll sort of look at those as options, but also understand that, you know, exhibitions at galleries are very important as well, and look to those and be sort of flexible and nimble when exhibitions come around. Yeah, I mean, in terms of specifically how the collection has grown and been built, I mean, we started firstly actually looking mainly in South Africa. So if you think of maybe 2015 to 2017, we focused mainly in South Africa, built relationships with galleries here. And I think most of the acquisitions we made were more by South African artists. But from there, we started to look more into Africa, build relationships with African galleries, attend biennales, and yeah, art fairs. I suppose 154 starting was a big help, being able to travel to London and Marrakesh and that kind of thing, and meet different galleries from the continent. And yeah, since then, I mean, we've really been trying to build more and more into Africa, sort of West Africa, East Africa. We're slowly building into North Africa, or building a collection around North African artists. But yeah, that's at this stage, that's sort of how we go about acquiring works. Yeah.
And we are very fortunate to have quite a number of works from the Scheryn collection on the exhibition. And you chose a couple to talk about. The first one is the Billy Zangewa.
Sure, yeah. I sort of thought I would sort of focus the choices on our acquisitions policy and maybe give a few examples, maybe speak less about the works, but maybe some of the motivations around purchasing and what goes into deciding to buy the work for the collection. And also just they're 5 works, and they all sort of represent, Billy's a tapestry, but they're painting, photographs, sculptures. I think the last one is a work on paper. So also just to give a sort of example of some of the stuff that we collect. Specifically, Billy, her work is very personal, deals with sort of domestic spaces and her sort of intimate experiences. And to be honest, she wasn't an artist that was on our radar, but we arrived at the Frieze Art Fair, I think this might have been 2017, and saw the booth and immediately fell in love with the work. The sort of the personal nature of the work, but also the materiality, being a silk tapestry, seeing it in person, and the color. It's quite amazing to see in person. Obviously, anybody who's going to be able to see the exhibition at Welgemeend must have a look. But yeah, so for us, it's someone that was maybe more of a off the cuff, and someone that we really liked, but hadn't necessarily been part of the plan for the year. And yeah, sort of amazing to be able to add a work of hers to the collection, and something that we love having in the collection.
The next one is by Lynette Giadom Bouaki.
Sure. So her work is maybe a little bit less personal than someone like Billy or Porsche, who is the sort of final choice. Her figures that she creates is maybe more from imagination. She's more interested in the materiality of the work. She sometimes paints works in a day. So she's really interested in how the materiality of the oil paint works. This one was actually purchased actually before I started, but from Stevenson Gallery. And I think the reason I wanted to highlight that is, I mean, galleries relationships for us are very important with a collection, building relationships and understanding sort of the gallery roster and who they represent, and getting to know the artists very well. And Lynette is actually not someone that Stevenson represents, but they bought her work from London for the exhibition where we purchased the work. And for us, that's also very important, because galleries provide that access to maybe markets that we don't know, artists that we don't know. They bring artists to have group exhibitions and that kind of stuff. So that's very important for us, and also a very nice and, I suppose, important role that galleries play in building the ecosystem in South Africa and the collectors around that.
The next one is the famous Yinki Shonebare. And, you know, one thing that is very striking about this exhibition at Welgemeend is that, you know, you will see work that you would never otherwise have the opportunity to be able to do so. And this is certainly one of them.
Sure. Yeah. So sort of maybe the opposite to the Billy, this is actually an artist that we had been looking at for a long time and had wanted to add a work of his to the collection. So this was, you know, in terms of the acquisition policy, this was, you know, a lot of time of researching, of reaching out to galleries, visiting exhibitions, and looking at what work was available. And yeah, we were sort of very, very happy and very excited to add a piece like this to the collection. And, you know, it's such a well-known African artist. Just a little bit about the work. It's actually a work dealing with climate change. If you are also able to visit the exhibition at Welgemeend, you'll see that the globe has scientific names of butterflies all around the world. And it's sort of dealing with nature's flora and fauna and how vulnerable it is. But also see, when you visit the exhibition, it's a very small work, sort of scaled towards obviously a child size. So the scale, feels very vulnerable in terms of the size and fragility of the kid, but also done in his very famous Dutch batik fabric, which is sort of a hallmark of his work.
Yeah, and the next one, Leonce Abujelo.
Yeah, so this is
by this work. Yeah,
this is a photograph and also part of a series of his. These are ceremonial outfits that are worn by the Yoruba tribe, and they are they're part of the ceremony where they seem to sort of carry the deceased to the afterworld. And he's created a series of 15 of these, so 15 individual photographs, all of different masquerades. And yeah, I mean, for this also, it fitted into the collection because we have work by another Beninese artist called Julian Sinzagan. His work is actually work on paper, ink on paper. And his work also deals with these masquerades, but in and these ancestral these ancestors, but in a work on paper. So the link between the two were very important for us. But also this is a series of 15 works. So as a collection, if we can collect deeply and collect full series of works to be representative of the artist, it's very important to us. I think it gives a good overview and a good sort of, I guess, representation of what the artist is trying to do. So if we can, in these examples, specifically with Leonce, if we can collect deeply within an artist's practice, either in a series or over the artist's career, we try to do that as much as possible.
And the last one is, of course, the Porsche Zava Bahera.
Sure. So this is I say maybe more of a mix between figuration and expressionism, probably closer to expressionism. And her work is also similar to Billy in the sense that it's very personal. The figures she chooses or the scenes she creates is from memory, but also from her dreams. And you'll see this work, it also has a very strong sort of religious theme to it, or iconography, which is important to her work. The title is actually translates to blessing. Yeah, again, another important work. We own a few works by Porsche in the collection, so collecting deeply again. And also she's part of a very strong group of Zimbabwean artists that are coming through Zimbabwe. And also within the collection, we have works by Admire Kumbudzingere, Wallen Warpendera, Mishek Masambu, Kudzanai, Chirai, potentially missing a few. But using that as an example, also just to say that if we, within regions, within countries, we like to collect and see what's, which artists are influencing each other, and try to support that and give a good overview of that sort of region. So, for example, this is from Zimbabwe, but we also do, for example, Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and the Congo. Yeah, so those are sort of just another example, trying to bring it back to our acquisitions policy and the collection.
Okay, Brett, thank you very much. I'm really impressed by your very considerate and very focused way in which you go about collecting your work. Very impressive, most impressive works. I'm sure people would rush over and have a look at these wonderful works.
Sure, thanks very much.
Our next panelist is Olivia Nani, and she is the co-director of the African and Modern and Contemporary Art Department at PIASA in Paris. Olivia, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi.
Okay, great. Hi, thanks for joining us. Olivia, I mean, you've worked at Sotheby's, Phillips, Christie's, now at PIASA, and apart from your success in the secondary market, as a researcher, writer, and curator, you've also been involved in a number of art fairs and biennales, which is really very impressive. And I wanted to ask you, sort of keeping with the theme of the figuration and the theme of collecting, in your sort of area of expertise, what have you noticed? Have you noticed any trends in collecting African art or figurative African art?
Yes, well, thank you so much for the invitation. I love talking about various subjects that the art community is concerned about, and figuration certainly is one of the big trends and one of the very important topics that are like being discussed at the moment. And well, trends, especially in figuration, I think what we are seeing, I mean, I was, for example, always interested in Asia, and I lived in China for 6 years after leaving Abidjan by way of Benin. And what I noticed is the growing interest for the international scenes, collectors from different continents getting really into collecting broadly and deeply African artists in figuration, but not only. And I think that this is very important. I was always looking at other regions, and for my experience in previous auction houses, where I got to work with a lot of modernist and post-war works from Francis Bacon to Giacometti. I was also curious to see whether the evolution of these markets could somehow predict or maybe give a direction to where the African market was going. And I feel that it's very interesting to see that in one way, we are also getting inspiration from the previous established markets where Africa will take its place, its rightful place in the coming years, but all at the same time, new markets are being created, new trends are appearing, and I think we are also going to see something entirely different from what was produced before. So globalization and the conversation with new scenes is for me one of the big trends. The second trend is, as usual, you have a overheating of the market. At some point, there will be a correction. But then again, we don't know what form the correction is going to take. But what I noticed also, and something that we're trying to push at PIASA, because I'm not the only co-director, I also work with Charlotte Lidon, who was previously at Sotheby's and a wonderful colleague. And we are very interested in seeing how we can really root what we see today in terms of African production to what was produced before. And this is why you will see in the selection, for example, some of the artists that I picked. I think it's important to really think about African art not as something that is a trend of today. What I often say is that being an African myself, African art interests me before it's a trend. It's going to keep interesting me. Sorry, French is my first language, so I have to disclose that. But it's going to keep being of interest to me even after the trend passes, if it ever happens. So for some people, what is a trend is history, actually, and we are very much involved in it for the long term. And for that reason, we're interested in masters and exploring. I love the term that someone mentioned before. I think it was Willem, masters we need to master. So this is something that we are very passionate about, and we want to see how we can connect the current trends to the previous ones. If we see what is happening, for example, in an African American market, we are starting to find interest in artists like Sam Gilliam, like Jack Whitten, who were previously overlooked, and realizing really the brilliance of these works that are now reaching stratospheric heights in terms of prices. And sometimes we are lucky that the artists are still alive to enjoy the flowers. But this is something that I think is also going to be more and more important in the future.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, definitely. I think it's a reality for most of the, especially art historians. I mean, it's not a trend for us. It's what we love to do before and after a trend comes. Looking at the exhibition and some of the works in the exhibition, you also chose, I think, 4 of your favorites. And the first one being the Gerald Sequoia. Do you want to tell us a bit about why?
Yes, absolutely. So we are based in Paris, clearly, and Gerald Sequoia, apart from being a very important South African artist, spent a large portion of his life in Paris. And I think this work is so important because of that. The trajectory that we think when we consider African artists is either artists who are based on the continent or who immigrated very early. And I like the idea of thinking about movement and mobility as something that was always part of the African experience. We can find traces of Ming ceramics on the East Coast as early as the 8th century. So Africa has always been a place that was in connection with other continents. And I think Gerald Sequoia really shows that. His trajectory is absolutely beautiful, along with his mastery of painting as a medium. And this is why also the idea of the self-portrait, it's an African telling himself and telling his own version of who he is. And I think that's very powerful and something that is still explored by young artists today. So for this reason, it's one of my favorite works in the selection. In the same research of that, we are exploring in our cells and in the work that we do at PIASA, schools such as l'École de Dakar with wonderful artists like Bokar Patedion. And we are really excited to keep exploring, these modernist schools, sometimes that are completely overlooked even within the market for African art.
Yeah. I mean, Gerald Sequoia, he was exiled to Paris, and I think he spent the rest of his life there. I remember, a couple years ago, I think it was around 2019, we did a sort of focused, curated session on South African artists who went to Paris, studied in Paris, exiled to Paris. And yeah, Gerald Sequoia was one of the key figures in that session.
Yeah, and actually, if we look at 1947, which is the date of the self-portrait, if I'm not mistaken, this is the year where he settled in Paris.
Yeah, it was. And the next one was, you also chose the Billy Zangewa.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now I know where to find it if I need to see it again. But Billy Zangewa is really a beautiful artist. What I love about her is that there is this a bit caricatural way of separating figuration or pitting it against abstraction when we consider that maybe abstraction is a bit more intellectual, which is also one of the reasons why I'm very cautious about this extreme focus on African art as figuration, because I think that there may be also a way of boxing in African artists in a way, and they work with really a full range of the artistic expression. And Billy, I do think, however, that there are still incredible, exciting things to do in figuration, and Billy Zangewa is one of the artists who does that for me. The reason why is that figuration is something, and I used to draw myself. I think a lot of people in the art world, we start with the dream of maybe having an art practice. And one thing that I noticed is that figuration gives you back so much. Nobody ever gets mad at seeing a portrait, but there is something that feels familiar to the human experience. You see someone who looks like you or not. It has a powerful narrative potential and content. But the good thing also about artists who excite me about working in figuration is these artists who are trying to complexify this conversation and having a practice that is complex. Like the thing with Billy is that she could make this work so much easier for herself to do. She could simplify the textures. She could simplify the compositions, even the postures of the characters. But what you see is that she is never trying to make it easy, always complexifying the details from the objects that the characters are holding, whether it's a teacup with a drawing on the porcelain while she's in her kitchen. It's incredible, and I think that's one thing that makes her work really resonate. She is not an artist who goes for the easy way. She is constantly challenging herself, and I think that's one thing that is very powerful, and that I personally look for when I am looking at an artist working in figuration.
Thank you. I am a bit conscious of time, and I know Laura does need to go. But do you still have two more? There's the William Kentridge, the Felix in Exile.
Exactly. Well, it's the same thing for William Kentridge. The artists that I'm mentioning have a link to Paris. I wanted also to make that connection. So just like Billy Zangewa, William Kentridge is an artist whom we have sold very successfully at PIASA, and his work with theater is exciting. I had the chance to interview him for an hour for an article that I wrote a few years ago, and he's just one of these classical masters who teaches you so much just by the conversation and through the work. And for that, he's one of the undisputed masters and will keep being one of them.
Yeah, indeed. And the last of your choice was the singer Samson.
Yes, so we are not only interested in classics, we think there are new masters in the making every day. And for me, singer Samson is one of them. He came on the Parisian art collecting map because of a big exhibition devoted to him in New York by Perrotin Gallery, which is a French gallery and is now represented by another important gallery. And it's just fascinating, you know, the mystery around the figures, the treatment of these characters, and the multiple references and layers of reading are really something really exciting. And it has been very interesting to see his work pop up in collections here and there. And I think this is definitely an artist to watch.
Yeah, definitely. I love how your selection included both the masters and also sort of the masters in the making.
Yes.
So thank you. I do have other questions for you, but I think maybe we'll move on, and then maybe at the end, if we've got time. So Wilhelm, would you like to take over?
Certainly, it's Laura Vincenti. She's director of the Investec Cape Town Art Fair. Laura, what impressed me about your CV is that you actually have an architecture background, and that, if I'm not mistaken, you were involved in designing a whole Olympic village at some point. I think it's most impressive, and no wonder, small wonder, you could take on the task of directing the Investec Cape Town Art Fair. Tell us about the art fair. What is it about? I think, you know, we started off by saying that collectors, you know, consume art, and I think the Investec Cape Town Art Fair, collectors are basically spoiled for choice.
Yeah. So thank you for inviting me to this panel. I will try to be as quick as possible because I know that we are running out of time, but so I'm very, very happy after 2 years to open again the fair in a week time. So we are all at the last stretch of work, and that's why I'm a bit concerned about timing, because I have to go to work. But anyway, so the fair, for the first time ever, will be an hybrid event. So it will be a physical fair at the convention center as in the past. And it will be also on a virtual platform. So we will give the chance to people that can make to come to Cape Town to browse around the works that will be showcased at the fair and buy if they wish to buy. So our theme is connecting. So connect through art from Africa and the world. We thought it was so important after almost 2 years of isolation and like more intimacy to highlight the aspect of connection and reconnection between people. So it will be like a fil rouge that will cross all over the sections of the fair. And we will host around 98 exhibitors with more than 400 artists from all over the world, especially, of course, South Africa, a big representation from South Africa, the continent, and Europe. Unfortunately, this year we won't have any American galleries, but or Middle East. But I mean, we know it's I always say to my team that it has been a miracle to organize this fair and to have people coming. So we are happy to have at least like 30 exhibitors from overseas. So it will be a very colorful and diverse fair, and we insisted on that because we want to bring back joy and hope to people. So the fair will have almost the same format as the past editions, like 8 sections. Few of them are curated. There will be a new section named ALT, that stands for Alternative Galleries. That is how it will be dedicated to projects that reflects how the many ways in which the art world had to adapt in response to the global shift from physical to virtual. So it will be open to 4 galleries, young, non-traditional galleries that will have the opportunity to showcase their artists in a non-conventional way, opening a dialogue between virtual and physical, and between own representation and connections, of course. Every year we have a curated section that is the solo section, and every year we change the theme. This year the title and the theme will be Inside Out. That, of course, is a reference of always of the pandemic. Will explore how artists have reacted to the intimacy and the introspection caused by the pandemic, as well as the effect that exchange and collaboration and connection, again, have on artistic practice as a whole. So it will be very much about how the artistic production have grown or not during the 2 years of isolation, and what does it mean in terms of growing for an artist to have connections in person. So I don't want to talk too much about the fair. I invite you to come and see in person.
So Laura, I mean, the theme of our exhibition is figuration, and I'm sure there are wonderful examples on your fair that you would like us to have a look at.
Yes, I made a very, very small selection of 5 works at the fair, crossing over the sections. So the first work that I selected is this work from Feni Chulumanco, represented by Ebony Curated. This is an amazing work. It will be shown in tomorrow's Today. That is the emerging section at the entrance of the fair that showcase a solo show from artists that, in our opinion and in the curator's opinion, will be the leading name in the future. So Fane is a local young artist, and in his paintings, he focuses on the depleted human figure, encasing them in glass boxes and contextualizing the idea of individualism. From a special, I mean, I'm an architect, so I like to be like a composition in the wall. Is a very strong representation, because you can see the human figure that is encased in this like glass and act or not act towards the environment. So it's Feni takes the viewer on a rich visual journey, allowing one to focus on our own identity, self-worth, and sense of fulfillment. So it's very much about the sense of identity and individualism against the world. So.
Okay, the second work.
The second work is a bit, is a different way of speaking about figurativism. This artist, Maya Berman from Aegon Art, it's a gallery, a German gallery. She's very young, and in her artist practice, she faces the challenge of putting together a repertoire of forms that expands through the relationship to one another. She really speaks about what is important of belonging to someone or to something. So as you can see in this work, she combined two human being and in a very particular way. And she used in her work a lot of different media, so not just wood, and she combined textiles and collage and also media like videos and so on. So it's very like it was very fascinating to me to see how she's obsessed by the combination of multi-figures and her like obsession about the sense of belonging.
The third one is by Mulanga. It's a work by Mulanga.
So this is Cincia Mulanga. She's an artist from Lubumbashi, the DRC. She's represented by both a project space, this new gallery, this new South African gallery. And Cincia, in my opinion, she's an artist that we have to look at and watch, because she will become one of important important representation of the South Africa art scene. So she speaks about beauty, and beauty constructs through her lived experience as an African woman. She creates moments almost always into a domestic world, so into houses, by using different mediums. Female silhouettes represent the perfect women perceived by society and social media. So she plays very much around that. She was saying that her model at the very beginning, when she started to this topic, was the Barbie doll. It was quite funny for me.
Yeah. The next work is from Snack.
So Luyanda Zindela, this work will be shown in the solo section, so about the intimacy in the period of pandemic. He's a local young artist. This recent body of work that will be shown at the fair is a direct response to isolation and the concept of time. The work began during the hardest lockdown in South Africa, and it was his way of reacting to that. The ritualistic cross-hatching of his closest friends' faces became a way for him to stay connected during a time of extreme disconnection and to reassess the importance and the impact of the friendship in his life. So he stayed connected with his friends by painting them, basically, by painting their face. I think it is very sweet, I think.
Yeah. And the last one you chose is a master, if we can call him that, Eric Laubscher.
Yeah, okay. It doesn't need an explanation. It's a magnificent work from Eric Laubscher, a South African modern artist, and I mean, it's very sophisticated and outstanding. So, I mean, I think he doesn't need any comment.
Yeah, certainly, I think, I can't wait for next week to look at the wonderful works that you're going to have, especially the figurative works. And then lastly, you chose a couple of works from the exhibition, also the Lynette.
So funny enough, the same work of Brett, and to me, this work, I mean, it says everything it says is said in the title, wishes above needs. Mm-hmm. That exactly what it speaks to me is about hope, is about joy, is about welcoming. It's just beautiful. That's why I chose this word.
And the second one is Dan Halter.
Dan Halter, I love his irony and his way of playing with like themes that are like deeply political and social, but the ways is representing them is always very playful. And this particular work that is showing this woman that is a refugee with the typical tartan waist plastic bags in this plastic position, like, I mean, refugees from Zimbabwe, so crossing the Limpopo River to go to South Africa for a better life. And it's so funny that he has put together like the crocodile and the hippo as a representation of the crafts and the crafter that are selling this craft works in South Africa from Zimbabwe. And they do the same way, crossing the Limpopo and going for different reasons, but also to make a better life. So I thought it transformed like a deep social and political issue in something like, to me, joyful. So that's why I chose.
Certainly a lovely work. And the last work from our exhibition is, of course, I think probably one of the most popular works on our exhibition.
Yeah. And also Atose chose this work, and I mean, it's a bit funny that we were 4 speakers and we chose almost the same works. Anyway, this work is amazing. It's, for me, is about the modern woman in Nigeria in the late 50s, where Nigerian was like finding his foot after the Britain domain, and it's just about the pride in this woman's eyes and the sense of identity and self-consciousness that they have, and it's just amazing. It's just an amazing work.
Okay, people, we are completely out of time. We were fascinated by everything that the collectors and the collections have to say about collecting contemporary African art. Perhaps I just want to end by reminding you of the talk tomorrow. And they are our speakers. It's going to be the same time. And perhaps the very last thing I want to say is also don't forget that we have an online auction starting on Monday, the 14th, sorry. And it runs for a whole week. And you can check out some wonderful examples of contemporary African art on that particular sale. Thank you so much, and for joining us, especially to our wonderful speakers.
Yeah, thank you all. I don't know if anybody has questions, but I think if anybody does, I think I stopped sharing. You can just pop it in the chat box. Alternatively, you can always just send us an email afterwards and we can pass it on to the relevant panel member.
Thank you, Arisa.
Okay, cool. Stop sharing. Okay, well, thank you. I know Laura's got to run, so thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, guys.
I think it was amazing. Thanks.
Yeah.